Welcome everyone to my talk and discussion on accessibility in AMP as a case study for what accessibility support can look like on the web framework layer. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I really look forward to our discussion today. So to give a quick introduction, my name is Caroline Liu. I am a software engineer on the AMP project, and I contribute to the UI and accessibility, Bento, and AMPHTML working groups. To give a quick overview of what I'll go over, first we'll discuss a brief history of accessibility efforts and processes in place now. Then I'll go over my accessibility vision for the project and areas for improvement in 2020 and beyond. And finally, we'll open it up to have a discussion about accessibility and the web framework. So let's dive right in with what accessibility support looks like today. As a note, this portion of the talk primarily covers the web format from the perspective of the UI and accessibility working group. So particularly with regards to our component library. So what we do today is one thing is support the basics. We manage focus as one of the essential basics. Historically, publishers using the AMP ecosystem have not been able to do this on their own as granularly as we can from AMP. One example of this is with the AMP sidebar component. The extension will programmatically look for a close button to focus on and otherwise creates one that is explicitly accessible to screen readers. So when the end user goes to open the modal, focus is immediately brought to the pre-existing or auto-generated close button to notify the end user they're inside a new modal and context. Something else we do is enforce accessibility hierarchies where we can. We do this through the code we write, through runtime warnings, and with errors in the AMP Validator, which is a tool that AMP can use to enforce some level of restriction on AMPHTML documents. We use these tools to have some amount of opinion on ARIA and role attributes, DOM structures, and really encourage folks to use proper semantic HTML wherever possible. So you'll see this example where you might try to use a tap event on a div element, which has no semantic meaning intrinsically. Our validator will say, hey, you're missing the role attribute and you're missing the tab index attribute. The first of which sort of allows the screen reader to notify users of what the purpose of the interaction is, and the tab index ensures it's focusable so that they can interact with it. And finally, we'll add accessibility attributes silently for consistent modal components. The other way we support the basics is to design for screen readers and keyboards. So if your user journey relies only on visual cues or only on mouse interactions, we need to find some other way that the user can engage with the website. Visuals shouldn't be the only way that end users can extract information from a web page, and likewise, the mouse shouldn't really be the only way users can interact with it. One example is our AMP selector component, where you can use the keyboard select mode feature to select different types of arrow key, spacebar, enter interactions with the component to navigate and select options. The other thing we have done really well historically on the AMP team is listen to our champions of accessibility. I will be the first to say accessibility engineering on AMP is pretty piecemeal and varies from engineer to engineer. Luckily, we have always had someone at the table who voices these priorities, and we always respond accordingly when given the opportunity. Of course, this is short from the ideal because this begs the question of what if we didn't have that person? While AMP as a team doesn't explicitly look to fill an accessibility engineer, I do believe as a culture, we look for people who care about the end user. And this is organically going to include folks who care about accessibility. I'd also like to call out our experienced and vocal leadership on the AMP advisory committee who also guide us in our accessibility efforts. So thanks to many of these folks, we've always had reasonable accessibility considerations front of mind in design discussions. Which goes a long way when these considerations are early and involved in the process. And this brings me to the third point. We require accessibility as part of the process. To share a quick anecdote, when I first joined the team, I was designing and building a new AMP autocomplete component for our library. And I'll be honest, up to this point, I had never worked on web accessibility features before. I had never even used a screen reader before. But as part of our component launch process, we required an accessibility audit on the new feature. And this was not just a checkbox of, hey, did you try out using it? It was actually quite involved. I documented our critical primary and secondary user flows and high-level steps to accomplish them. For example, one of the most critical pieces for autocomplete is to be able to type into the input and receive suggestions. And I also had to break this down into steps. The end user should be able to focus on the fields, they should be able to type from the keyboard, and the options they receive should match the initial input and change on continued input. Other critical user journeys include navigating between the suggestions and selecting from the suggestions. And just by hearing these examples, I think it can become pretty clear how the process of designing features to be accessible really produces well-honed features in and of themselves. I'd also like to note, as part of the process, every single accessibility bug that surfaced as a result of the audit had to be addressed as a prerequisite to launch. So baking it into the process was pretty significant things for us to have, because not only did it guarantee an accessible component at the product level, it also indirectly required me to gain experience with web accessibility that I've carried forward into new projects. So having something as part of the process makes it so that engineers who might not know or care to ask the right accessibility considerations suddenly become engineers who do. And your team and your product is all that much better for it. So with all this in mind, we support the basics, we listen when we're told, and we require some baseline level of consideration. What more can we do as a web framework? I want to share some of my vision for ways AMP can contribute to an open, accessible web for all. And I look forward to hearing what folks think in our discussion. But first, I want to cover two facts. To set the stage, the Web Accessibility in Mind organization conducts an annual Million Pages project that assesses the top 1 million homepages on the web. They found that 98% of homepages do not meet standard accessibility with respect to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And let me be clear, these are only the automatically detectable errors. Those constitute only a small portion of all possible WCAG failures, so the single and double A conformance levels are likely much lower than even reported here. 98%. Another fact I wanted to share is that a 2016 study on web accessibility found that 100% of users benefit from accessible, usable content. The study found that for all users, WCAG compliant websites result in faster task completion time, higher task completion rate, higher ratings in usability, trust, positive sentiment, and aesthetics, and lower ratings in cognitive workload. So it didn't take so much energy to even engage with the website. For example, web accessibility also benefits people using mobile phones, smartwatches, smart TVs, really anything with a tiny screen or an unusual input mode like a remote that you're typing with. The other thing is, if you're new to this area of work, you might reflexively think of accessibility as being relevant to people with disabilities. And while it's important to be inclusive of the 20% of folks who self-report as having a disability, let's also expand our thinking to include folks who have temporary disabilities, like a broken arm or lost glasses, or maybe carrying 2 grocery bags in their hand. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's tried to look up the route to a destination while I was trying to drive somewhere and wanting desperately in that moment for there to be a safer alternative to input things into my phone. And then finally, accessibility features also benefit users in challenging situations like bright sunlight, noisy environments, low internet speed, or limited bandwidth. So the key takeaway here is that designing with accessibility in mind helps everyone, not just those who need it. So what does this all mean for AMP? AMP should empower you to build accessible pages by default. But even more than that, AMP should make it hard to build inaccessible pages by accident. Let's say if instead of a super fast web framework, AMP was a certain Swedish furniture manufacturer and your user wanted to build a chair. You can give them the materials, you can give them the instructions, but at the end of the day, the end user can still build an uneven chair. You can do more to decrease the likelihood of it being uneven. You can measure your right angles, you can recommend more concise tools, but you can't hammer the nails in for them and you can't stop them from sanding down one of the legs. But you can be sure that you did everything you could. All this is to say, accessibility is a team effort every step of the way and requires that everyone along the pipeline considers the accessible user journey in their piece of the task. So how can we get from where we are today to an open, accessible web? For AMP and at the framework level, this translates to a component audit, because even though we have launch processes in place, there are many components which had been launched before this was in place or have gotten so many new features, it really doesn't hurt to take a second look in isolation. And that goes hand in hand with an AMP page audit. For live pages, we want to answer these questions. How likely is a user of AMP to build an accessible page? And if it's not accessible, how off is it from being accessible? And in that gap, is it something we could have done for them? The audits aren't just so we can work towards getting a gold star sticker. They should go hand in hand with robust documentation improvements. How far does this component or this framework get you, and how can you get yourself the rest of the way? How can we define a well-lit set of steps for you to get there? And we also want proactive features, not bug fixes when accessibility issues are discovered and encountered and the damage has been done. We have our launch process, but what other processes can be put in place to create accountability in developing accessible features? And then finally, we should introduce automated and manual testing. So milestone audits aren't our only point of failure. This includes regression testing. Today, AMP's automated tools for integration and end-to-end testing can support accessibility features to a degree, which is pretty awesome. But exactly what to test to ensure accessibility and how to test it is not well defined within our code base. We talked about identifying critical user journeys for a manual audit. This is an excellent starting point for where we can invest in hard coding those very cases into each component's test suite. So these are just some of my ideas for how we can shift our feature development to be even more accessibility driven, because remember, at the end of the day, this work benefits all users. So thank you everyone for coming to my talk. I intentionally left plenty of time to open it up for some questions and discussion. Yeah, how are people doing?
Thanks, Caroline. That was a really great talk. Thanks for introducing all those things. I was also picturing users buying a chair and just sanding down one of the legs and being like, I don't understand why it's uneven. But I think that was a really good analogy. So,
Thank you.
Oh yeah, Malta said that he'd like to see some version of this talk at Ampconf. So that's great. I don't think that we've actually have final plans for Ampconf yet, or maybe Malta would know better if we didn't do. But yeah, any questions about accessibility or thoughts about what the topics that Caroline brought up? I do know there was like the advisory committee, I know there's been a lot of discussions with the advisory committee about accessibility. Did you have any thoughts on that, or anything that that you're still working with the advisory committee on, or is that mostly they've given some guidance and we've run with it?
The advisory committee has very helpful guidance. I think some of which may require some like long-term concrete planning to incorporate in our roadmap. But something like a component audit is totally like on the horizon and something we're working on now. But the other thing I wanted to add is that accessibility considerations are like, I have my opinion on what we should do, but that's totally not standard in what web frameworks should do. So I did prepare some discussion questions if folks would like to think more and share their opinions on accessibility and sort of what the role of the web framework should be. That's actually the first discussion question I had prepared for folks.
Yeah, that sounds great. Does anybody have thoughts on this question?
Can I ask a question live?
Sure.
Since I'm too lazy to type it. I was wondering, do we have like a summary of tools we could start adopting? Like for instance, I've been noticing like a lot of projects, they switch to running tests exclusively through accessibility metadocs. Like up to a point, people disable query selector all for tests, and you just have to like specify some accessibility information. Or maybe some like automated tools that just sort of maybe we can add to the storybook.
Yeah, absolutely. I know our storybook now checks attributes and like literal markup, but something at the level of like JavaScript would be really cool. Does that answer the question?
There are linters that we should sorry. I'll go. There are linters that we should explore, like to at least make part of the development process as well.
Yeah, maybe linters, maybe like some automated, like start a storybook and runs, at least export this report and push it somewhere. So we should definitely explore some of those.
I've got a question regarding this. I'm really interested in this. So I work as a web developer at BBC News, and we have our canonical pages and our AMP pages that we're working on in tandem. And because we're a public service news organization, we have to consider accessibility from the start. So we've got a whole lot of tools and things that we use in our linting and in our end-to-end tests, in our manual tests and things. And I guess I'm interested to know what's the appetite of including some of these, like we're using JavaScript, Node, React for context, to introducing these into AMP, because it's not really clear how much input people would want or desire in the project.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And also my next discussion point, which is, my third discussion point, which is how much should we enforce accessibility in our position?
Oh, Caroline, I think you got muted, unless it just broke for me. It looks like you're.
Hello?
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Oh, great. I don't know. I'm assuming people heard nothing.
Yeah.
So I did have this prepared as a discussion question, which is how much we can and we should enforce accessibility on web pages. I know at the level of having support for these tools for folks who want access to this information about how accessible your web pages or your components may be. I definitely am interested in adding that support. Whether or not we should, more strictly enforce this is, I think, unclear.
Does anybody else have thoughts on this?
I have some thoughts, I guess. I think what would be really helpful actually there was like a unified list of mistakes that the web platform made and that they can't fix for backwards compatibility reasons. So I think AMP has this one really nice example of not allowing click handlers on elements that aren't accessible to folks who can't use a mouse. There's a relatively finite list. So I think, and like every framework kind of has the same, needs to solve this and rediscover these problems. So it would be really nice if there was kind of this shared database of you know, things that can be improved at a layer higher than the web platform, and then, you know, so folks don't no longer have to worry about it.
I think it'd be really great for us also to, by the way, this is Chris, hi. I think it'd be great for us to also do things like add these kinds of additional accessibility validation checks as something that people can run optionally on their AMP documents, independent of validation. This is the kind of things that we already optimize around with things like the AMP Optimizer toolbox, which allows you to do additional configuration on top of a traditional AMP document. But this could be a whole suite that exists to enhance the accessibility of existing AMP documents.
I mean, we have the AMP linter, which is part of AMP toolbox, so it would be easy to integrate such checks in there.
Hi, this is Becca. One thought that I have is when we say accessibility, there are different types of accessibility that are conflicting with one another. Like the type of accessibility that allows people with like red, green color blindness to see pages clearly might like by fixing that, we could cause more difficulty for people who have like dyslexia and other reading disabilities. And so I wonder if we're going to enforce, how do we choose what types of accessibility to enforce on? Because changing it to benefit some people might in fact harm others.
I'll be interested in knowing like actual examples of that. So for us, we have a core set of principles that are available online. So the BBC presents it, it's publicly available, that kind of synthesizes a lot of the, so there's lots of documentation in terms of specific accessibility guidelines that are quite difficult to read for people getting into this field. And so it's kind of a bit more of a human readable translation for devs coming into accessibility for the first time. And that can be really useful as a first port of call. I mean, there are lots of other resources online, but in my experience of like in the last 4 or so years, like looking at accessibility as part of my delivery of my work, it has tended to be the case that they are generally not conflicting. And really what we need to do is we need to reconsider how we're designing our pages. We need to be looking at it at the initial stage and not just at the development stage, but at the design stage, at the product manager stage, at the business analyst stage. And that's where the conversation should be happening in a lot of cases, so that you don't get into a situation where you're trying to make trade-offs in the engineering side.
For sure. I only bring it up, I had read a couple articles about how trying to make pages more navigable for screen readers, for example, can make it harder for folks with like dyslexia specifically as a reading disability, because the way you need to break up content so that they are able to read it can often conflict with the way you break up content so that a screen reader can read it. And so I'm just curious, I wish I could cite to you like any sort of studies, but I'm just interested, like how do we as both developers of the framework and as users like balance this to make a more accessible web?
So I do look forward to seeing your resource and learning more about this. My initial instinct is that there are, even more explicit tools, such as like the DOM has this feature called an accessibility tree, where you can outline sort of like a completely different and explicit navigation pattern for folks using a screen reader. I know like a product like Google Docs will have a very different accessibility tree because their layout is like all HTML, CSS, and it's an editor. So if an intervention needs to be done at that level, we do have the tools for it. I am also curious about whether or not it's necessary and what kind of intermediary solutions are possible.
Would regarding sharing knowledge, I understand that being people building the framework, you might not have access to like the user research of product teams who carry out accessibility research on AMP pages. And I'm not personally aware of like a central resource. I think Marta was mentioning like central resource for some things to be shared. I'm not really aware of a central resource for those types of user research gathering. So maybe that's another discussion, more of a, not just for this group, but more of a wider discussion about web research regarding accessibility.
Yeah, I would say, Sarah, it seems like you have a lot of knowledge in this area. So if you want to, you might want to consider joining the UI and accessibility working group. They're always looking for new people to help out and to provide voices in this area. So Caroline would be very happy to have you on there. I think you can go to go.amp.dev/WG, and that will link you to all the working groups, including the UI and accessibility working group. Great, thank you, Caroline. I'm looking forward to seeing the version at Ampconf. It sounds like you've been signed up for, so.
Yeah, thanks everybody.